Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library. My name is Sayre Holiday. I'm here from the library staff just momentarily to welcome you and mention a couple of things. As we begin, we acknowledge that the library stands on traditional lands of the Lenape people and other indigenous peoples to whom we pay respect. If you are new to the library, we just celebrated our 270th anniversary. In addition to our large collection of books and other materials, beautiful reading spaces like this one, our children's library, and other services, we offer a full season of events with authors and other presenters, so do please take a look at what's coming up. And if I could ask you to silence your phone or anything that might interrupt tonight's conversation, that would be great. Thank you. As some of you will know, the building we're in right now is the library's fifth home. It was built as a mansion in 1917 and has been the library since 1937. It's a New York City landmark. This building has undergone various renovations since then, including our current expansion of space for both books and people in other parts of this building. But it is important to us to maintain the historic feel of the original home. We are also honored to give the New York City Book Awards each year to a handful of the best books about the city, its history, and its architecture. All this is to say that the values expressed in Beyond Architecture, the New New York, summarized as honor our past, imagine our future, are central to this library as well. We congratulate Dr. Barbara Lee Diamonstein Spielvogel and all the contributors on the publication of this important volume, and also want to express our thanks to Ron Bowling and Jonathan Martyr and company for their work on organizing tonight's event. We do have copies of the books concerned tonight for sale, courtesy of our friends from the Independent Corner Bookstore just outside this room following the presentation. We're honored to have with us tonight contributors Vishaan Chakrabarti, Thomas Dyja, and Rosemary Vietor. Vishaan Chakrabarti is an architect, author, and the founder of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, a design studio dedicated to building ecological, equitable, and joyous communities. He is the author of A Country of Cities, a manifesto for an urban America, and most recently, The Architecture of Urbanity, designing for nature, culture, and joy. He spoke at the library on A Country of Cities back in 2014. Thomas Dyja is the author of 3 novels, a biography of civil rights pioneer Walter White, The Third Coast, When Chicago Built the American Dream, and New York, New York, New York, 4 decades of success, excess, and transformation, which was a New York Times notable book, and on which he spoke to the library's audience in 2021. Rosemary Vietor is vice president of the Bound House Historical Society at the Bound House, built in 1661, older than the library. It's the oldest surviving structure in the borough of Queens, in fact. She is also a trustee of the New York State Archives Partnership Trust and formerly served on the board of the Colonial Dames of America. Her honors include the Garden Club of America Award for her work in conservation and in national affairs and legislation. I am now glad to hand the floor over to our speakers. Enjoy.
I think the one thing I will say to start, because I think how do we talk about preservation at this moment that feels as if everything we know and love about New York is under siege at this point. And I think that was my piece as not an architect and not a architectural critic, was to ask what we needed to save. And it was written a little while back. And when it felt like there was another shoe that was going to drop, a shoe that is now seemingly hanging over our heads. And I asked myself, what do we need to save? And for me, it was how we live here. That the buildings are a part of that. But the thing we have to make sure of is that we preserve how we live in New York. New York has only been a part of the United States since 1782 or so. Before that, it was part of the British Empire. Before that, it was part of the Dutch Empire. Before that, it was, as she said, part of the Lenape Empire. This is a city that its meaning, it's the way it lives, how we are, just goes beyond any kind of national thing. We are a city and a world unto ourselves in New York. And I feel that's something that we need to preserve, and landmark preservation is one of the paths to do that. I think Rosemary has some ask the question, if we're not going to talk about that now, what's the role of that and how we go forward? I hand the football to you.
To me, well, thank you. The Bound House has witnessed it's been around actually when New York was a Dutch colony. And the house has been preserved thanks to the efforts of the family who's resided in the house, actually from 1661 until 1945. And they are known for their commitment to public service. They were a Quaker family. They were very religious. They were involved in most of the social movements of the day, including abolition. We were recently recognized by the National Park Service for membership in their Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. And we're the only such site in Queens, which is remarkable because Queens, as a Quaker stronghold, was a hotbed of abolition. But as you probably know, there's very little documentation because these activities were conducted in secret. We were lucky enough because the family preserved in the house 3 centuries of personal correspondence, diaries, letters, maps, important documents. And among these, by putting the pieces together, we were able to establish the family's connection with the abolition movement, which is a very interesting story. So until 1945, the family occupied the house. It started as a very modest structure, but John Bound, the founder, had a total of 16 children. So the house had to expand to meet the needs of the family, but the last addition to the house was made in the early 19th century. We have a lot of our original furnishings, which is remarkable. It's probably unique among historic houses. Most houses do not have their original furnishings. And we've been a museum open to the public since 1945. And every year we welcome a number of visitors, especially visiting school children, because there's a real lack of education currently that emphasizes American history and values. So that's what we do. That's our audience. And as we become increasingly, known in the community, we do welcome a lot of school groups. So that is the synopsis of the history of the Bound House.
So it's great to be here. And I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to Barbara Lee, Diamondstein Spielvogel for bringing us together, because it's very interesting. If you haven't had a chance to look at the volume, I'd really encourage it. It's a very interesting group of writers whom she curated. And I think there's a through line. I mean, if you think about everything Rosemary just talked about, it's a kind of preservation of change, right? To talk about the abolition movement and so forth. And so one of the things that I thought was an interesting through line in the entire book with so many of the authors was to not think about preservation as this act of casting things in amber, right? But rather to think about, a kind of intellectual challenge, a kind of dialectic about this idea that, preservation only exists in the face of change, right? So many people think about preservation as something that is fundamentally about the past. I think about it as something that's fundamentally about the future, because you're preserving things for the future. But that also means that change is the yin to preservation's yang. And I think we're all schooled, I know people were talking about Penn Station over here earlier, we're all schooled in the history of the 20th century in terms of understanding these things as a binary. The change was the problem, preservation was the solution. I think the 21st century things are a lot more complicated than that. and require us to hold kind of these two ideas at once. Because to me, preservation and change are kind of dance partners, right? My firm is the architect of the Domino Sugar Refinery, and I don't know how familiar you are with that. And that building is a city landmark. It went through a very good, I think, and healthy deliberation in the Landmarks Commission. And we had a near unanimous vote from the commission, except for one commissioner who felt that he had a conflict and abstained. And so, and I think we had a very good conversation with the community, with a number of the civic groups. And to me, it's kind of proof that we can pull history forward into the future, that we don't have to think about history over here and future over there, that we're either dealing with, an absolutely historic neighborhood, or you're dealing with Hudson Yards, and there's nothing in between. Jane Jacobs famously said that one of the characteristics you need to make a dynamic city, a vibrant city, is a mix of old and new. And I always think about this if I'm in London or Paris or Tokyo. There are so many places you can go where you see the old and the new cheek by jowl. And I've always felt that in this country, we're a bit more insecure about our history. And so we're not so comfortable with that idea of the new sitting next to the old. Same things with changes in scale. I've always been interested in this idea that like all the tall buildings go in one places and all the short, like imagine this with your friends, like you only have tall friends if you're tall or short friends if you're short. Like, because Tom talked about New York and a way of life. And I think that has to do with a vibrance that comes from serendipity, right? From the unexpected, right? From juxtapositions that seem maybe sometimes jolting, but are very, we're not Boston, right? It's a very important thing that I think that's part of the dynamic energy of New York. So to me, that is, I guess, the place I really wanted to start the conversation. This idea in the book that's brought by several authors about preservation being an act about the future. And I think that's an interesting thing to talk about.
Right, yeah, I mean, the period that I wrote about in my last book, really one of the things that kicks it off is the preservation of Grand Central Station. And the statement that preservation actually is something that we are going to respect, and that it is not just a kind of nice thing that people try to do, that it really is an important law that matters. And that was a kind of starting point. And it was one of the things that, New York has a great tradition of tearing things down and moving on. When we used to live here in the 18th century, on May Day, everybody moved. Everybody picked up and moved. A vast number of people moved to another apartment. And that kind of, which is so different from now when we're dug in, but constant change, constant dynamism, up and, it was part of what New York was. And so there was a certain mindset going into even the 20th century that, well, it's New York. We just do it. We just tear down and keep moving, and it was a really important moment to see Penn Station be destroyed, a place that people really did love and was a brilliant masterpiece building that should have been saved, and there was a toothless law which was not enforced, and there it went. And so Grand Central was a place, a kind of reckoning moment for New York to say, do we want to do this? And it answered that question but brings up the point of Jane Jacobs, a mix of old and new. And we consciously started to say, yes, and looking at Soho, which is another kind of same period, which is again, the city looking and saying, what can we do with this old space? What can we do with it? And that was not a conscious decision. That was Moses planning to blow through and the owners we could just let some artists live there, that would be fine until we can come up with something. And that ended up creating a dynamic space in a mix of old and new. So I think that that's very, very true. I don't know if I agree that we don't quite have, that we're more embarrassed or something, where we have a weirder relationship with the past. I think it's just that we want to just there's a impetus to just keep moving ahead. And maybe it's just a short attention span. But you know, that there is, well, and I think that's a New York thing, because like in Chicago, there is a worship of buildings. You know, I think it's a New York thing. I don't know if it's an American thing. If you go to Chicago, that downtown, that Loop area has buildings that you will get in a cab and a guy will ask you who your favorite architect is.
Yeah.
No,
it's true.
It's true. I mean, they really, really believe it. And I grew up with that, like you, Louis Sullivan is a god. And that's just not a New York thing. Here we love developers.
Yeah.
Up to a point.
Yes. Right.
Queens was probably the last area of what's now New York City to be developed. It was really rural until the late 19th century, and actually did not want to become part of New York City. But that was overruled and it was incorporated into the city. Originally, it was a series of small farms and villages. And now in Queens, they keep in many places the names of the original village, like it would be Queens Village or Corona, or you know, whatever they were known earlier. And in Brooklyn, that's somewhat different. Of course, the Bronx is different. But you mentioned Robert Moses, and it was Robert Moses who really, through his series of roads, kind of made drastic changes, particularly in Flushing, which is fairly close to Manhattan. And it was quite a suburban area until late in the 19th century. And now most of the original buildings are gone. It was quite a handsome community. It was really kind of a summer resort for many people who lived in Manhattan. And Moses destroyed one of the nicer houses in Flushing, which actually belonged to a member of the Parsons family, but preservation was not on his mind. He just wanted to
But so that's an
get to
example.
Jones Beach.
Exactly. That's an example of him that we think of him as being anti-urban in so many ways, or that's kind of the received position at a certain point.
Mm.
And that's an example of him actually urbanizing, kind of destroying
Yes,
the rural
for a
area and
purpose.
turning it into city.
Between the World's Fair and his desire to get out to Jones Beach to create sort of monuments to himself. That's the word. Anyway, but the house is still there.
Yeah, there's this wonderful plea in Tom's essay for us to get past the Moses
Yes.
Jacobs
I
binary.
know, here I am.
Yeah.
Right, and
Bringing it up, which
I was really glad to read, actually, because I do think we face such a fundamentally different set of challenges right now. That neither, and I'm gonna start saying some heretical things, neither Moses nor Jacobs had very good answers for. You know, Jacobs was a brilliant observer of cities. I don't think she gave us much of a Rosetta Stone for how you build cities. You know, she understood what made cities great as they existed a priori. But I don't think, you know, I mean, one of the issues with Jacobs, of course, is it led to this kind of death of expertise, right? This idea that urban planners didn't know what they were doing, architects didn't know what they were doing, right? Everything had to be community-based. And then, you know, I mean, I've been at this for 30 years and I've yet to meet a community member who does something that's totally unrelated to our fields and who you're supposed to expect, like, sure, let's have that person fix the infrastructure of New York City or come up with a solution for Penn Station. It's an absurd thing on its face. It's an undue obligation that we put on the citizenry, and it's one of the reasons why I'm on governor number 6 with Penn Station. I've been trying to, you know, fix that thing for well over 20 years now. And the amount of process we now have layered into every single aspect of the world of public building has made it almost impossible for us to do anything in a way that is astonishing compared to Western Europe, frankly,
Hmm.
which has plenty of environmental laws and unions and other things that check and balance systems. But we have this extraordinarily Jeffersonian way of diluting power to the point where we can't do anything.
Right, I think there have been some instances where large buildings and projects have been stuffed down people's throats in the community, so I think there's a system of of giving people their voice, but lots of times the big money still gets the thing done.
I think we're extraordinarily good as a city at building large scale private development. I think putting the infrastructure online that should come concomitant with that development is few and far between. I mean, Dan Doctoroff, when he was deputy mayor, famously, as a city official, got the state to extend the number 7 line, which was like practically unheard of. You know, to give the devil his due, I mean, Andrew Cuomo did fix LaGuardia, did fix the Tappan Zee, and actually did a lot in terms of what's happening at Kennedy right now. But, you know, I don't know, when it comes to public infrastructure, I don't think we're as good at that.
Yeah, okay, I'll give you that. I think here's my beef that Jane Jacob, is that I think that sense of, I think gentrification, a word I hate, and I think I used once or twice in the entire much too long book, that sense of consumerism, of lifestyle as a consumer good as opposed to a thing you do. I'm one of the few people who that metaphor of the ballet of the streets, I don't like that. Because you're there and you're observing it all. There you are standing, you know, here's the butcher, and here are all these people doing all these wonderful things, like they're putting on a little show for you. And what's always made this city work is when people get in there and dance. And that's not something that is a part of that. It's go to this adorable place. And I think that gentrification went forward with that mindset of go live in this really cool neighborhood. Like, are you gonna join the PTA?
Well, she did move to Toronto.
Right,
Oh, and almost
but are you gonna get on the
unforgivable act.
community board? Like, what are you gonna do when you get there?
Yeah.
And I think that's the part that is not in there, or it's assumed, but it needed to be said. If you're going to go be in that kind of wonderful place, then you have to pick up a hammer and not just fix your building. You then have to somehow be a part of that community and not just use that city for your kind of pleasure. And so in a certain way, I do feel that head really brought us to not a good place, because the kind of waves of people going to a place because it's cute. That's not urbanism fundamentally. Okay, you the last thing I will say about Moses is, if you've never read Marshall Berman's book,
Oh, great book.
All It's Solid, is kind of like, well, in a nutshell, and correct me if I'm, is basically, here are all the things you wanted cities to be, and he's kind of doing it, and this is what it looked like. And there's a much deeper way of looking, but it's about developing in the city and kind of what the left and what kind of socially progressive people wanted from urbanism and from cities, and that kind of shows kind of what he's doing here, and it's pretty awful, and you need to reconsider what you want cities to be. It's a really, I think, a really important basic book. Not as much fun as our book was, but
No, never. So, I don't know if you want to chime in on anything Tom said.
No, I was just thinking about what you said. I've lived here, actually, I was born here, but then I basically lived here since the 1960s. And I've seen an enormous amount of change. I've always been on the Upper East Side. But I remember, you know, all the wonderful French bakeries that are no longer there, little French restaurants, family owned. The German area,
Yorkville, yeah.
Yorkville, all of that's gone. I think there's one butcher shop that's left. And just in that short period of time.
Is that because the buildings that house them are gone, or is it because what in those spaces have changed, or both?
Both,
generation,
like
I think that the community also
Ugly
aged.
Gimbel's building,
Right.
and, you know, it's just, it just is they're vastly different. And not, I don't think it's particularly attractive these days,
No,
and wildly expensive.
that's,
So that's a good segue into, let's talk about the present.
yeah, enough of that.
Let's talk about the
We did
present.
that.
I think we are in a 5-alarm fire. Right, we are losing population for the first time since the 1970s. Right, we're losing historically Black populations, we're losing a lot of our immigrant populations even before everything that happened with the election. The city is wildly unaffordable. The things you just raised have to do not just with developers, but the way development is financed. So, bankers, incredibly conservative people who, so when a building gets financed, even if a developer wants to put a local restaurateur or retailer there, the banker's like, nah, I'd rather have a bank ATM. They pay, they're called credit tenants, right, for the people who are in that industry. And so there's this amazing way in which it's soul crushing for the environment of the city. And so we need to build a lot more housing. And building more supply is not the only, there are other things, there's tenant harassment laws, there's all sorts of other things that need to happen, some of which have happened. But our per capita housing production is much lower than San Francisco. And San Francisco is notoriously one of the most difficult places to build in the country. Furthermore, the few places, so Queens has seen, Western Queens has seen an extraordinary amount of housing. I don't remember the exact statistic, but if you look by community districts, you'll find that a very small percentage of our community districts are absorbing most new housing because the other districts fight them tooth and nail, right? And you can talk to Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor de Blasio, what's his name, Adams, and they will all tell you, even though they come from different ideological spectrums, that building a homeless shelter in the city in some of the most supposedly progressive neighborhoods in America is virtually impossible. And so we just need a sea change. And I'm really glad we're talking about this as a group that probably cares about preservation a great deal, right? Because it's, maybe why you're here. And I'm going to go back to this idea of preserving the future. And I'm going to go back to something Tom said that's fundamental, which is the thing that I really want to preserve is the sense of welcome New York gave me as an immigrant that I don't think is there anymore. I think it's virtually impossible. And it's a collective action that we've created here, right? And when I say that, I just want to be really clear. I am not saying, therefore, let's hand all the keys over to the developers and let them build as much market rate housing as possible. We have all sorts of tools in our toolkit. My office did a study about a year ago about how to build 1 million new housing units in the city while maintaining neighborhood character without destroying landmarks districts or even actually building that much in landmarks districts. There's an extraordinary amount of land in New York City. So we found over 10,000 sites near mass transit, out of flood zone, that had either parking lots in them or one-story buildings where we said, forget about the zoning, because the zoning is crazy. Just look at, from a design perspective, what scale buildings would fit in these neighborhoods. Found housing for over 1 million New Yorkers, right? I think given what's happening nationally in this country, if we've got people saying, the country's full, we cannot be in the same position saying the city's full. And so we have a collective responsibility, it seems to me, to figure this out together, right? Because again, this is not about the binaries of the 1970s, right? And so, I do think there's a way to do this. The City of Yes thing that they just passed, it's a good step forward.
What's the relationship between that and what you're planning? Is there a
City-
certain, there are little overlaps, right?
So yes, for those of you who aren't familiar with this big city initiative, they did a bunch of zoning changes, it just got through city council. It allows things like, if you own a single family home in Queens, you can build what's called an accessory dwelling unit, like what some communities call like a grandma flat above your garage or something like that. And I know that sounds like small beans, but actually in single family neighborhoods, you're doubling the density.
Right.
When you do that. And it allowed for a bunch of things like that. The thing about it is, and again, I think it's a very admirable thing, it adds about 80,000 housing units over 15 years. Our thing was looking at about 520,000 housing units. Which again is enough. I believe this city can be a city of 10 million people. I think we. Let me explain why. Let me explain that. So you probably all know the term adaptive reuse. Adaptive reuse is incredibly important in preservation, right? You need to breathe life into older buildings, right? That's what Domino is. Do a lot of that work in my office. I'd like you to think about that concept in a more expansive way in terms of adaptive reuse of the city. We have this extraordinary legacy infrastructure. We have the only major subway system in the world that has express and local tracks. We have these things that if we upkeep, we can adaptively reuse to house a lot more people who desperately need the housing. And we cannot sit comfortably in our homes and say, nah, I don't think so. We can't do that. So it seems to me we have a fundamental moral obligation to figure this out and figure out a way that maintains the character, but not just maintains, propels the energy of the way of life that Tom kind of opened with that is so central to New York.
Which seems to be about, a lot of it is expanding it into this big city. I mean, when we talk about Queens, I mean, I don't know that going into, is it building more tall buildings on the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side? I mean, I think Manhattan is already crazy dense.
If you look at our article, of the 520,000 units, 330,000 of them came from mid-rise buildings in Queens, Brooklyn, and Bronx near subway stations that were about 50 or 60 unit buildings, 5 to 15 story tall. Right. The problem is our development industry has they reacted horribly to the article. They have no interest in building that stuff. We used to have nonprofit builders and community builders in the city in the Koch era. We don't anymore. So we just have builders who are interested in building big glass towers. So that's like yet another issue that we need to solve. But that's the real workhorse, are those mid-rise buildings.
Right.
And Queens was filled with that kind of development all through the post-war era. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that's true middle class housing. That's true middle class housing. Near subways, incredibly environmentally friendly because it was near subways.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to live in cities. And, I grew up on the northwest side of Chicago in a two-flat, in a place, a lot of two-flats and bungalow, the kind of old, that bungalow housing you see in Chicago, kind of prairie influence kind of thing. And that was a goal. I mean, that was generationally, that was a thing. You got a house, you got your front yard and your backyard, and you had a house, and that was a way of living in the city. It was lower density, but it was that was that kind of life of Queens or other parts of Brooklyn. I mean, that was a way of living in the city, and it's valid and it's not necessarily tall. And so when I think about the kind of NIMBY world, or how do we, I think we're at a point of almost demonizing that desire for the single family house. And I'm getting there, but having grown up in that world, it's hard to say your way of living in a city is wrong. I've yet to get there. I would, and we need more housing in those areas, but I think it has to be, I just feel it's hard for me to just single that kind of world out and say you're living in a city in a one way, and so I agree with, I think 10 million is the number that we're going to end up, whether it's all happy, we're moving to New York kind of folks, or people ending up here looking for some kind of sanctuary from climate things or political or whatever, we're gonna need to know how to deal with that. So that transition is hard. I'm still,
I
we have
think
trouble
it's-
with transition. here
Yeah,
sometimes.
and
Am I being
that,
too
again,
frilly?
no, I think the binary thing is hard. I also think telling people how to live is really precarious. To me, I think neighborhoods that have more mass transit that aren't in flood zones have an obligation to take more housing. Right? A single family neighborhood on the western part of Staten Island, really, that's not a great place to build a lot of density.
Right.
Right? You know, and so it's just, there's a nuance there that's really important.
You need other things besides housing, you need other infrastructure, if you're encouraging families, you need schools, you need hospitals. You need shops, you need restaurants, you know, there's a whole list of other things. And also, I think if you're adding a substantial amount of population to the city, you need park space. People want recreational space.
Right.
You know.
Well, that was one of the great things about your plan though, was that it was that infrastructure, you know, you could incrementally heat up things and expand. The kind of structure that Rosemary's talking about is already there, and you're just kind of expanding the density of people there. You don't have to build new infrastructure, you just have to build it up.
If you built the park first, you might find that the people would be more inclined.
I totally agree with you. Believe me, the problem is, look, I was very involved in the early days of the High Line. No one imagined people would pay $4,000 a square foot to live on 11th Avenue where no subways ran. You know, just because they were near I mean, Central Park has kind of the same history. I mean, like, you know, there's that great scene in the Scorsese movie, the End of Innocence, that shows like the beginnings of Central Park and Fifth Avenue. You know, it was all pioneering stuff, and parks do that. I just want to make the point that, like, if you go to a city of 10 million people from where we are right now, 8.4. What we know, if every time you look at the step function of the city going from 6 million to 7 million, 7 million to 8 million, the city's tax base expands enormously. So around 9/11, when we were 7 million people or so, right, the city's budget was about $42 billion. The budget that we passed last year in the city is like $108 billion, right? You know, so there's, to pay for all the infrastructure that Rosemary's talking about, you have to have a tax base. And it's really precarious if people are leaving the city. How are we gonna pay for these things?
Right, well, that's it. Don't say doom.
No, I'm not gonna say doom and gloom, but I am deeply worried about not providing enough housing.
Right.
And the infrastructure that needs to come.
Well, the other wildly complicated thing that I think nobody has any interest in picking at is property tax in New York,
Yes.
which is complete.
And
It's
income tax.
basically at a certain
Under
moment, there was
taxes.
just an agreement to say, do you know, let's just make this, let's just put some tape on this and like spit over here and see if it holds together, because logically it makes no sense. It is wildly unfair, and to pick it apart and try to refashion it now would be revolution. I mean, I don't know how we would do that.
I used to ask my students why there are surface parking lots in Soho and Tribeca. It's one of the most expensive land in the world. And we use it to park cars. And a huge part of the reason is what Tom just put his finger on. Because your taxes are really low on a surface parking lot. You put housing on it, it's improved land, all of a sudden your taxes go through the roof.
Right.
It's the nuttiest thing in the world.
On the other hand, I used to love going to those flea markets and the parking lots and
To buy new
6th
socks.
Avenue. No, furniture, as a young man, there was better stuff in the 80s, now it's
Yeah, it's true.
but you know, people actually had furniture to sell. So it's better. Yeah, but that system is, I think that's another, if we're talking about money, that we've built in by agreement, but profound inequities in our tax system, property tax system in New York. So I'm not asking for that to be reopened, but we all come up with all these other things we need to talk about, and that one is primary.
The townhouses, for example, have generally a very low rate, much lower than a
Very
co-op
low,
apartment.
right, because they're one unit.
Yes, but I think amazing.
It's crazy.
And co-ops are I mean, dare I say it, living in one, like they're undertaxed, it's just profoundly are. And on the other hand, no one wants to
It's
say.
the compensation you get for putting up with your co-op board.
That's right.
Right.
The one other thing I think is really important to talk about relative to all of this stuff is, housing and more people, we talk about all these numbers, taxes. It's not widgets, it's the culture of New York City, right? And I want to live in a place that is the energetic, serendipitous, vibrant place, that we young people around the world seek, and I really fear losing that. I mean, sorry, I reread it this morning, Tom, so I just keep going back to your piece. But like you talk about how like we used to argue about cars, we still probably need to argue about cars a bit, but like the real force of the city now is, the digital and the internet. And how do you combat this thing of everyone? I was on Fifth Avenue the other day, and there was a woman reading a novel on her Kindle as she was walking on the sidewalk. It's extraordinary, reading Moby Dick as she's walking on the sidewalk. To me, one of the most powerful things about cities is how people of difference see each other eyeball to eyeball in the city. So we know we've got technology and social media that has algorithms that are designed to divide us. And the public space of the city is the place where we can see people who are different, who pray differently, who vote differently, who think differently, and we can interact with them in real life, right? And to me, having a really healthy, affordable housing stock and infrastructure that works and all of those things are fundamental to, keeping that sense of energy alive and keeping that consciousness, right? Of being with people of difference. We have to be with people who are different than us. If we've lost everything, if we have no capacity to deal with difference. And I think it's one of the most, it is the thing that is getting stress tested in this country right now.
Well, I think one of my favorite quotes I came across at all, and one of the people I really encountered writing my other New York book, was Holly White, who was kind of a great urbanist who really paved in certain ways Jane Jacobs' way, and he was very deeply involved in zoning and kind of creating the space we have, living spaces and public spaces in New York. And he said at some point, and I paraphrase, cities exist to facilitate face-to-face exchange between people. And the less we have of that, the less the purpose, then it's just a bunch of people living together. And it's, basically next to each other. And so every, at least you gotta be nice to the DoorDash guy when he comes, there's that. But I mean, not going out, not being out there, buying something on Amazon, like, it just, every little choice you make reduces it just that much more. And I know I sound like a Luddite or but like, you have to go out and do that stuff, and those things become a kind of, not just a meditation, but they're it's more than just a spiritual path. It's how the city works. You need to go out and get that cup of coffee. You need to go say hi to that guy and get the paper. Like, those actions are literally what makes New York work. So yeah, put down your phones, man. I mean, I think that's in any kind of future confronting what's ahead of us, we leave all that nameless. I think putting our phones down 90% of the time is going to have a lot to do with that, because that's how we're going to find communities that are going to be strong enough to deal together in a collective fashion for whatever's going to happen, because collective fashion is going to be what is going to make it, not just sort of individual hand raising and virtue signaling and hitting send. So.
And it would help if people went back to the office.
Yeah, no, I agree.
What happened during COVID?
Yeah.
They're all sitting at home on a Zoom call. And all of the networking and the interaction that went on.
I agree.
In an office situation is lacking. It's not the same on Zoom.
And that is happening. I mean, it's interesting, this this East Midtown rezoning happened right before the pandemic. It yielded One Vanderbilt, it yielded Chase's new headquarters. I know a lot of people were upset about Chase's new headquarters because
It's weird.
well, I actually have a lot of involvement with that project, so you can call it weird.
Sorry, but-
No, you can call it weird.
Wow, is that
You
something?
can call it weird, but the thing is, it touches on two things you both said. I think it's really important. And I know people, there was a very handsome SOM building that got recycled actually. But wasn't a landlord. But the thing is, Chase made this commitment to say, like, we're gonna have 15,000 employees in an office. And they also felt like, if they didn't do this and they pulled out of Midtown. That going back to your thing about dropping every shoe repair place, every pizza place, what would it signal if JP Morgan Chase were to leave Midtown Manhattan? I mean, that's extraordinarily. And the thing is that, like, I know people are getting acclimated to the building. I love that in the beginning of Tom's essay, there's this picture of the shadow of the Empire State Building. The pictures of the Empire State Building when it was first built. I mean, not only was it a super tall, it was a super fat. The Chrysler Building had those sort of elegant, Ozempic proportions, but on the Empire State Building, I love it. When the Rockefellers built Chase Manhattan Plaza downtown, I started my career at SOM, and at Sierra Mill, there's a beautiful sepia print of Lower Manhattan, all of that masonry, and then there's one Chase Manhattan Plaza kind of glinting in the sun. Like, what a radical revolutionary building that was at the time. We don't think of it that way now. And so these things, yes, we need to bring people back to work, and the office stock that we have in Midtown Manhattan is largely atrocious. It is a terrible place to work. Air change is old, the ceiling heights are low, the bathrooms are substandard, things that are very difficult to fix. And these are also buildings that are very, very difficult to convert to residential. And so we are gonna have a new generation of very tall buildings in Midtown. Now, you can say you don't like that. I've never understood this thing about I love New York and I don't like skyscrapers. That's a really funny argument to have with yourself.
Right. What it is, my evolution is that the commercial ones are great, honestly. I mean, they make sense. The residential ones,
I'm with you.
that's a problem. That's a whole other kind
Yeah.
of statement being made that was not really that interested in the shoe guys and the pizza places.
No.
That's like having the one chef up there sitting by himself, waiting to make somebody eggs if they drop by.
Because they drop by once a year.
Different kind of thing, right? So
Yeah.
anyway, Matt, sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you there.
And I think that is, I've never heard people grumbling about those kinds of commercial buildings in the same way. But I'm gonna say the one, having grown up in Chicago, as I mentioned before, the city that takes crazy pride in skyscrapers, and this is also true here. Part of the wonder of those buildings was that you owned it. Like when you went downtown, you took friends, you went to the Prudential building. And it was like, it wasn't expensive, it was part of what you did, and then you went to the Hancock building, you went out and it was not expensive. And the more those things have been priced, I don't know how much it costs to go to the top of the Empire State Building, but it's crazy. And the cost to go to the one in Hudson Yards, it's like $100. Like it's off the
I
charts.
couldn't tell you.
I mean, and so it's not like something you were just like, I got friends coming in, let's go do this, or like I want to take my kid. It's a real thing. And even World Trade Center, you went up and you could see it, and you had the sense of this is like, I don't want to say ownership, but belonging, and part of that world. And so I think the difference is that these places are now commodifying that space, and I get the numbers game, but it keeps New Yorkers away from them. And I should be able to go with my grandson whenever that happens and go up and say, look at New York.
They're for tourists.
Yeah, but like they weren't like, and they should be, but they should be. Those new spaces are for tourists, right? They're not for New Yorkers, and we need more of those wonderful spaces to be for New Yorkers again. I
I
mean,
have
that's,
a fear of heights, so it's all
great.
cost. A really cheap date, yeah.
go to the zoo, we'll keep the zoo nice for you.
The zoo is
That's- Maybe questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
May I hand someone a microphone? Gentlemen first, but then.
Thanks for the very good talk, I appreciate it. Marty said, but I wonder if you haven't been a little hard on this town, New York City, after all, it compared to if we can grade on the curve for a minute like a teacher, it looks pretty good compared to most other American cities. After all, its population since 1970 has grown quite substantially. In most other cities, I wish it were true, is not true, that's not true at all. Also, in regard to the population, I know you're hard on New York because it doesn't build enough housing, but the truth of the matter is that in the matter of public housing, New York has more public housing than all other major cities combined by a considerable margin. We have been great compared to other cities in providing for the poor, and that shouldn't be forgotten. And then when you talk about our inability to build housing, if you just look beyond our 300 square miles, the metropolitan area, now there's where you see the discrimination. Because over the last 100 years, since 1926, they've had zoning, which systematically reduces the possibility for any sort of housing except single family. And man, if you want social equity, you might look beyond the borders of our 300 square miles. There's a lot of housing opportunities there on transportation lines that could be developed, but they won't touch it. So I like New York, and there's something to be said for it, even in terms of its attitude towards social justice.
I think that was largely directed to me. First of all, let me just state, you know, I've tried living outside of New York. It's like shoes that don't fit. It doesn't, you're not gonna get any argument for me. Right, but this is all about for the love of the city, right? And the city has a history of dynamic. I'm glad you brought up our public housing in Dyja. Yes, we have the largest public housing stock. It is criminal what we've let happen to it. It has almost a $20 billion deficit. You know, during Superstorm Sandy, which wasn't even a hurricane when it hit our shores, you had grandmothers living in public housing that could not get out of their apartments because they are in such substandard condition, right? And so where are we gonna get the money? I mean, it's certainly not coming from the federal government, right? And so we need to think about how we fix these things. And I don't buy the basic idea that because we love the place, we can't criticize it. We criticize it because we love it and we want it to be not just better, but more fulfill its manifest destiny. I agree with you about the suburbs. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. The suburbs need to build more housing along the transit lines. I completely agree with you. That's not going to solve New York's housing problems, right? We have a huge housing scarcity and we cannot just say it needs to go elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think that I categorically reject the dystopian hellscape kind of rhetoric that is fed to us, in that sense. And we do have to ask hard questions, but we have to do it with a sense of love. In that narrative is one of the joys of writing a book that was a 40-year kind of span, was watching people talking about crime jump every time 6 to 9 months before an election, and then about a week after, forgot about that, and then right before an election, crime, oh my God, New York's and this has just been another repetition of, which is not to say there's not crime, which is not to say that there haven't been horrible periods, all that's all true, but it's also a fact of New York that's been regularly manipulated to create certain situations. And so I think we have to be really thoughtful about the context in which we do have these discussions just in that way, because I think people have been very eager since COVID to say really rotten stuff about New York and do it with a real agenda.
Yeah.
But which was not just about a clear-eyed view of urbanism, but there's a lot else going on there.
So I agree with you about how human interaction seems to be on the downswing here. And three drugstores have closed in this neighborhood just in the last year. What could we do to incentivize more retail? Because I think that's a big complaint that people have, and that, it just doesn't seem very New York-like to be ordering everything, with a screen, with your fingers. And, I miss the interactions with, shopkeepers and that sort of thing. But you go into a store that exists now and, they have very little stock. They don't have your size, and you wind up buying online. I'm sure you've all had that experience.
Yeah, no, retail, my next book is a history of clothing in New York City. So I've sort of been dealing with retail and the rise of department stores and stuff. And retail department stores were a massive, and not just in New York, but in Chicago and cities all over. Department stores weren't just about the clothes or what you were buying. They weren't just about the retail. They were places that taught you about what else was going on in the world. They were places where you heard music. You did all kinds of stuff. The biggest bookstore in America for a while was the book department in Marshall Fields in Chicago. I mean, these places were really exciting, vibrant, culturally important places. And that's not going to happen again, but it was with people. You were packed in, you were and that was the joy of them, and the importance of them in developing cities, really, and urbanism. So yeah, I think that face-to-face thing is crucial, but you have is there more to that question of why retail has drained away on the main drags, largely because a lot of kind of side streets of Columbus is in better shape than Broadway is. You don't walk down Columbus on the Upper West Side and feel quite as depressed as you are at certain times. What are the technical behind the weeds kind of things you were saying about financing and stuff? Are there?
Well, yes, so the big buildings, the big new buildings really struggle with this because of this credit tenant issue, and also the spaces they create, a mom and pop store can't afford to rent and all of that stuff. So that's why I think on some streets you see a finer grain.
Right. So what do we do about that? I mean, in the sense that we want to build more, we want to build bigger buildings, what can we do?
This is such a good and important and tough question, it really is. Look, we need more shoppers, so we need more housing, right? Again, I hate to sound like a broken record,
Right.
but also, so just, I don't know how many of you have gone to Domino, but at Domino, even though that's a lot of big new development, Two Trees, General Entis, who runs that company, absolutely will not rent to a chain store. So every single shop is a local shop. But how do you regulate that? That's just someone who's made the decision to be a good New Yorker.
I mean, did he take not to show, I mean, did he take a loss for that, or is he sort of absorbing something?
No, what it was, so it's interesting, because his father, David, famously bought Dumbo and rejuvenated Dumbo. And they decided to do the opposite of Battery Park City. Battery Park City, which was could come before Dumbo, but always struggled with retail, had a lot of rules, and signs had to look a certain way, and everything was kind of a bit over designed. And David's attitude was, I need a grocery store. If the Korean grocer wants to come in, great. Right. And I don't care what his sign looks like. He's a grocery store. And there was just this kind of rough and tumble attitude he had towards it all. And no, I don't think they've done economically poorly with that at all.
Right.
And it is an act of curation, and it's an act of being a good New Yorker. We need people in the building industry who are more thoughtful than the people we have, quite frankly, right? Especially that upper echelon, upper tier tough stuff. This is another binary we need to break. It's not all developers are bad people. We have to really seek out the developers who are good and want quality architecture and want local retail and want things that are more sensitive to our city's character, and find ways to encourage them. And one way to do that is to not put them all in one ugly basket.
But one of the differences in that kind of rebirth of the city, the long passage from the Koch years kind of on, was that he was starting from a place and of most of the big businesses and big developers being New York based or having grown up in New York. So you had CEOs and people who had skin in the game. It was their childhood, it was their life that they wanted to save here. And as time's gone by, the money, real estate, families, all that kind of stuff is much more from outside. And we end up, I think, being a kind of, I don't want to say used or something, but we're the site of transactions. And it's a lot harder to convince somebody in Dubai or Seattle or pick a space to say like, this matters.
Yeah.
It's hard to explain that.
Especially if they don't have that culture in the places where they're.
Exactly. And so sometimes what we as New Yorkers want and know we have an instinctive sense of what those things are, but trying to get that somehow out of a business that is very much removed and looking at us as kind of pixels and numbers is really, really hard. And that how do we make those cases to those places? Come visit us.
Who makes these decisions? Is it left to the individual companies? Somebody from Dubai decides?
It's the developer and sometimes the people, the talking about are the financiers, the people who are putting the money into the building. And they're like, they've never heard of mom and pop store, but they've heard of, chain store. And so I want a chain store.
A small personal, I was refinancing our mortgage years ago. And the bank that had just been bought was guaranteed rate out of Chicago. And so they wanted comparables, and we live at 79th on the east side. And so they wanted comparables within a mile. And so what they gave us places in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And these aren't really comparables. I know it's a mile, but that's not.
It's a big mile.
Park Avenue, that's not going to be a comparable. Like it's so, and it was just these folks in Chicago. The people were just, but it's a mile. So that kind of home knowledge matters. And I think in real estate, surprisingly so, since real estate was traditionally New York's one great natural resource. Other places have oil, whatever, but New York was how fortunes were made in real estate. J.J. Astor, it was real estate, and that has been this kind of replenishable thing. And we've lost control of our natural resource, basically.
Well, the band certainly lost control of their real estate. They own most of Flushing.
That's right.
And land in New Jersey and land in Pennsylvania.
Who do they sell it to?
Well, that's an interesting thing. And actually, I did have a visitor at one point who asked me about that. He said, well, they had all of this land. Where did it go? Well, if you have 16 children, it starts very early being dispersed, and then they have children. And then in the case of the land in New York City, it was largely taken by eminent domain. They had the area around Times Square in the 1700s, 1800s, and then the city, bought it out.
So this is such an interesting thing because the family landowners, especially in Manhattan, that I've run across, actually you never get to meet them, you meet their lawyer's lawyer, but like, it becomes dispersed among a big family, as you're saying. And then the problem is, those people just they don't even, like, half of them don't even live in New York anymore.
Right.
They just want to collect a steady annuity, basically. And that annuity, if it can come from a TJ Maxx or a Foot Locker, great. Right. And it's a huge problem,
Right.
I mean.
So, the hard thing is that we talk about in terms of philosophy and intent. And that doesn't very often, or at least not enough, get to what the real problem is, which are these kinds of decisions being made by, without any relation to it. We can fight about all these things, but at the end of the day, that decision is going to be made. I'm going to have a Foot Locker unless you somehow put guardrails.
I think the one piece of agency we have over it, and it goes back to something you said, just don't go to Foot
Don't
Locker.
go to Foot Locker. That's
Right, and teach your kids not to go to Foot Locker.
Right.
There is, I think part of the issue, like, I don't know if anyone's from Dubai, I don't want to offend anyone, I've been to Dubai, don't necessarily want to go back to Dubai. Jerry,
It's great.
huh?
It's great.
And that chocolate.
The shopping, when I used to travel a lot, I try to bring home something local for my kids after the trip. You can't buy anything local in Dubai. Yeah, I could get my wife a bottle of Chanel #5 and I could walk down the street and buy, it's crazy. And so the thing is, that is one definition of modernity and success. Another definition of modernity and success is the value of local grain and local life and local character. And I don't think we talk about that enough, that's something that we need to kind of elevate in this very digital, very,
Right.
financed world, right? Of what actually makes the grain of the city an idea that's about the future.
Right.
Hi, so I missed the bulk of the talk, so I'm sorry.
That stuff.
This is our voiceover.
So I'm sorry if this question has been covered or off base or anything, but there's that building that was built in the last decade on Park Avenue, or in the high 50s, low 60s, and it's like a skyscraper, perfectly rectangular block.
Right,
I can't think of the name of it, but when I grew up here and when that was being built, everybody, my parents, my friends, everybody who I know was not a fan of that building, thought it was unattractive and et cetera, whatever. A friend of mine, his brother's an architect, and he told me that he actually really admires that building because he was explaining to me the technical difficulty that goes into making a building that has nothing protruding, that's just perfect cube. And I don't know, I was just inspired by what you guys were talking about, and I wondered if you had any strong feeling about his point and about that building, and I don't know, I was curious.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Mies and kind of international style. You started at SOM, so you must have a certain taste for it too as well. But so people building buildings for their own kind of interests and whatever is I'm fine with that. And I think that building was, because it was so specced out and the apartments went for, I think the top apartment was like $9,700 million, something like that. I mean, it was built, it wasn't built as housing, it was built as a very tall investment for people to, it's like a kind of lotto game or gambling house, and all you're doing is, I mean, so in that sense, the building is, it is remarkable in certain ways. I think there are things about it that are, I've come to not like it less as time has gone by. And listen, I'm at the same time, I'm in favor of people making interesting statements. New York for a long time lacked a lot of interesting buildings. I think there was a real period where there weren't a lot of interesting architects coming here and doing things. And so I think it is great to have those people come, but I also would love them to have some sense of connection to the place. And that was, as we've been talking a little bit about super talls before, the fact that's a residential one probably made me sniff more than anything else. Because you could argue the kind of lines in architecture are like,
Just one little interesting anecdote about this. So I think it's the best of the residential super
I
talls,
think that-
but right, but I actually got into an argument with a very, very famous New York preservationist whose name I shall not mention, because that person insisted that the Robert Stern super talls were significantly lower than they are in fact. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating that one could be so beguiled by style, right? That 220 Central Park South and 15 Central Park West weren't super talls. No, Vishaan, what are you talking about? It was like 200 feet tall. I'm looking at this person and I'm like, those buildings are not 200 feet tall, right? But somehow, because they've got some, big gargoyles on them.
right. Well, that's a fascinating stylistic question, to have gargoyles on, right.
After COVID, we would get
we would get updates that 30% of the workforce was in offices again. The railroads were bringing in 40% of the traffic that commuters that they did before. And we stopped hearing those numbers. And I think, you know, I'm not a professional in this in any way, but the women who I spend my days with would talk about all of these office buildings, wondering how are they doing? What is the situation with the return to work in New York? I do know that we talk about the past because we are of a generation, but my personal experience with younger people is that they've adjusted very well to living without a downtown. You know, their lives have adjusted to home more, family time more, going into the office 2 or 3 days a week. And, you know, people have left New York in the past, manufacturing left and then finance came in. But what about what's happening now? I don't think we don't know.
Do you know what the numbers are?
I don't know the exact numbers. I just signed a lease for my office space and I will tell you, things have come roaring back. Things are, you know, office space is in demand. Right? New office space is especially in demand. The older like wedding cake buildings from the 60s and 70s with low ceilings are still a pretty bleak thing and will probably have to come down.
That's the question. You know, you do see in some ways a city, well, not only New York, but other cities that are based on a model that is no longer it may be somewhat obsolete, you know, people are not driven back. We may draw them back if we come up with some great
I think
plans.
it's
but
happening. I mean, I think
It
the city is.
I heard that.
Most companies are mandating 4 or 5 days back in the office. JP Morgan Chase is doing that. Most of the tech companies, the older tech companies, interestingly, are doing that. Texas has some of the highest return to office statistics of any state in the country, interestingly. And so, and look, for those younger people that are acclimating the way that you're saying, I mean, it's really hurting them. They're understanding that they are less in line for promotions, that their senior people don't know them as well, they're not learning as well. So, you know, the pandemic was a massive event, and I think we're still dealing with the detritus of it, but I think it's coming back.
Yeah, I do, but I also agree that those buildings
are in trouble and they're gonna come down.
But I mean, that's the kind of thing about preservation where we also get into that head of saying, because it's there, there's some reason it's there, and you know, the hesitation to take down crap buildings is something we should get past. Take them down.
You know, Emery Roth was a great residential architect. He was a lousy commercial architect for the most part. There's a couple of good Emery Roth office buildings, most of them are terrible.
Well, I think the success of Brooklyn kind of explains what, if it works well for them, if you build it there, they will come, you know, so building it, I guess, is perhaps a challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe one more question, if we have, did I see one over here? Oh, maybe 2 more questions, if you don't mind.
Thank you, I'll try to be brief. I appreciate the meeting of the minds here. I grew up in Guilford, Connecticut, just surrounded by historic homes. I just finished my master's of architecture at Parsons, and I know there's a direct link between seeing these historic buildings and being inspired to do better with the buildings we create and renovate. So I'm coming to the end of a research fellowship at Parsons, and I'm looking for work, and I wonder, and I'd love to stay in New York and continue to be able to pay my bills here. Is the help that's needed, is it on the design side, is it policy, research, et cetera? I'm just curious to hear your perspective in that regard.
Oh, I sit in a room by myself writing all day, so I have. I'm sorry, that would be a Vishaan question.
I think all of the above. There's help needed at every level. The government is in real trouble right now.
In New York, one of the things from that 70s to 2000s, whatever, was that there was this cohort of people who were really got involved in the city in a very profound way within city government and really found an immense amount of reward and were devoted beyond any politics to just making New York great. And a lot of them were in housing, a lot of them were in building and urban planning and stuff. And those people really, we should be building statues to these people because they really made this city what it is now and saved it from what it could have been. And so if that's a thing you want to do, please do it, because we need people who really who care about the city.
It's really, I mean, Tom, there's a whole Koch cohort, there's a Dinkins cohort. I was in Bloomberg season 1. And like, we've really come together. And this next mayor is gonna need a lot of help and a lot of intelligent people working to, put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so, there's a lot of important work to do out there.
Did we have one more question right here?
Seems like it's a tale of two cities. North of Grand Central, you're doing phenomenal. The A level office spaces, it's amazing to come back to New York City. What do you do in all this housing? What do you do with all those B and C level office buildings south of Grand Central? It's like horse and buggy time. What do you do with them?
Actually, Midtown South is doing great. Midtown South leasing, like down Park Avenue, south of Grand Central, is doing fantastically well. Right? It's like 6th Avenue in the 50s.
Yeah.
Or 3rd Avenue in the 50s. That is not good. And those buildings are gonna have to
It's a
come.
big chunk. What do you do with those?
They have to come down. The interesting thing is the Class B and C buildings are they're either rented by companies like ours, who can't afford Class A buildings, but still they've got some qualities to them that are nice. Or they can be converted to housing because they're smaller and they've got operable windows and all of that kind of stuff. The big bulky like Don Draper 60s buildings on 3rd Avenue and 6th Avenue, those things are coming down.
Yeah.
They're gonna come down eventually. I mean, it's not gonna be overnight because you can't convert them to residential. And they're just big lumps.
I would love to do over on 6th Avenue.
6th Avenue is not something to be preserved. You heard it here.
You're referring to the corporate road starting at New Rockefeller Center and going up to the Hilton.
Yeah.
So your book that you're here, the reason for this is to publish this book. And you presented a myriad of challenges that exist right now. And we all agree, or most of us agree probably, that New York is a great city. And what you've alluded to, the desire that it continues to be a great city, but it needs this and that. Does that ultimately make it a political challenge? Is that basis of what you're talking about?
I mean, politics is always going to be a part of it, right? I mean, but the political will to look at interests in different ways. I think one of the interesting things was Koch considered banking one of the interests in the city. He did not look at certain things as being, and I'm not like worshiping Koch or that, but saying there are different ways, the given that we have, that these things, we must follow what real estate says, we must do what the banking people, that changes. And I think the political will on how an administration makes choices and lines people up outside the door, in that sense, it is political. It's always going to be political, but then there's just pure money. And I think making those choices between when market interventions are, when the market works, like when you're talking about two trees, or, the French do it, they pretty much regulate what you, they have a crazy amount of regulation in Paris about what can go where. And I happen to like Paris a lot, and that kind of works there too. When do you open up a free market? When do you let things, when do you make choices for people and for the community that way? And that is a political thing. So is it always gonna be political. It's always gonna be there, but I don't think fundamentally it has to be.
I would just say politics is always driven by culture, right? And culture is driven by us. So we can't talk about political things as at arm's length. Right? They are a byproduct of us. Right? And so, you know, what worries me about a less affordable city is that rich people like the status quo. It serves them. Right? And so, you know, it's incumbent upon us to want a politics of change, even if we're well served by the current system. That to me is a cultural question.
Right.
Thank you so much, George. I think it's kind of celebrating